Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to our listening audience. Thank you for joining Interfaith Intercultural Dialogue. Excuse me. I'm your host and moderator, Mujahid Ramadan. I believe we do have our guest panelists on the line for Interfaith Intercultural Dialogue. Are we there?
This is Chiou with U.S. Attorney's Office.
We have our guest on. Okay, Mr. Haseebullah from ACLU. Athar? And we should have U.S. Attorney to Nevada, Chiou.
Good afternoon, Mujahid. How are you doing? This is Chris.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear your voice. Thank you all for joining us today on Interfaith Intercultural Dialogue. To our listening audience, language of the Quran and Muslims, thank you for joining us. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum. And I believe we should have Athar Haseebullah. He has not called in. We're waiting for him to call in.
I am on the line. Can you hear me?
Okay, good. I can hear you now, Athar. Thank you for joining us. Peace be unto you.
Yeah, of course.
And for having the ACLU present. We are waiting for one other call from a person from the public safety law enforcement aspect. As some of our guests may notice, or some of our listening audience may notice, on the advertisement came out, State Attorney General Aaron Ford was due to be one of the panelists today, along with U.S. Attorney Chiou and Athar Haseebullah, who's the Executive Director of ACLU. Attorney Ford is now en route back from Washington on a flight. He was delayed, so he can't call in. We've looked at some other options, and they may call in. But nonetheless, I think it gives us an opportunity to have a wholesome, round-welded discussion on the subject matter today for Interfaith Intercultural Dialogue is social justice and the criminal justice system. So as its point, we have two persons, one representing, we now have three, I believe. Do we have, is that possibly Captain Carlos Hank?
Affirmative. I'm on the line.
Okay, good. And thank you for joining us. So thank all of you. It's been a rush morning for myself here in Southern Nevada. For those who are listening, and probably many of you, the weather is changing and getting nice. But it was just so happens that I was at the Las Vegas Government Center, and we were having a memorial service for Melvin Beetle Ennis. God rest his soul, and may he have a safe journey home and ease his pain, increase his joy. To the Ennis family, obviously, we extend our condolences, and that you practice patience and gratitude during this time and take advantage of the blessings that we've had with Melvin. Just so happened for some of you, former Undersheriff Kevin McMahill there, he knew Beetle, as we called him, quite well, and spoke quite well on his behalf in representing what he had been to public safety and law enforcement. So we appreciate that, and we appreciate Beetle, and we honor him and hold him up, he and his family. But certainly appreciate our panelists for taking times out. Chris, it's always a joy hearing from yourself, Athar, and Captain Hank, who has recently been transferred from Bolden Area Command to the Captain Hank. What division are you in now? That you're over?
The Office of Internal Oversight.
Office of Internal Oversight. So what that somewhat means is that he looks into the police department that he's a captain in and helps establish guidelines and constitutional law and things like that. He may share more with us about it. But so thank you all for joining us. As our listening audience knows, that Interfaith Intercultural Dialogue, this is more of a cultural subject today, while all faith communities call for justice, in particular, and we're talking about social justice today. To all three of our panelists, one of the questions that we had, and I think you all have received a copy of them, is that we still have this continual call for social justice in America by organizations like one of the leading organizations today is Black Lives Matter. But we have people from the entertainment industry, from major sports and athletes who are involved in sports, major corporation, elected officials. Are these still valid concerns? Is social justice still a valid concern? And why in social justice is the criminal justice system the middle of the target? Because they say there's a lack of social justice in healthcare, in industry, and in economics, and obviously they say in the criminal justice system. But more often than not, the social demonstrations that we see are around public safety and or law enforcement and or the criminal justice system. There is discussion about economics, and I would strongly recommend to our listening audience, if you haven't read the book, The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America by Sean Rochester, I would strongly suggest that you read his book, and the subtitle is What You Can Do to Help Create 6 Million Jobs, 1.4 million businesses missing in the black community. So social justice in the criminal justice system. One thing that I'm reminded of to our panelists is that recently we saw a celebration or a memorial service around the Tulsa, Oklahoma really massacre at this point in time, early in the 1900s, maybe about 1920 and 21, and it actually went around all over the country. And it was implicated that public safety, law enforcement, had a role in the destruction of that community and the capital investment that was there and the loss of lives. Is there still a need or call for social justice? Attorney General, U.S. Attorney General Chris Chiou, your observations about that?
Thanks, Mr. Ramadan. Appreciate the chance to talk about this. I think there are certainly many improvements that the system can make before everyone achieves the American dream of receiving equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. Mm-hmm. There's been improvements since, there's been a lot of change, a lot of improvements since the Tulsa situation early in the 20th century, but we're certainly far from perfect, and there's a long way to go. To your question of why the criminal justice system is obviously focused upon, when we look at all across aspects of American society, and we have the health system, the education system, that there are improvements everywhere. Your question, if I heard it right, is why is criminal justice often in the spotlight? And I think it comes down to an inherent disconnect that still persists and still lingers. Where on one hand, there are many underserved communities where there is still a gulf of mistrust between the communities and their law enforcement agencies. And on the law enforcement side, there could be officers who don't share that common heritage, and it makes it more difficult for them to understand the reasons behind that historical distrust. And the result is that those officers would find it more difficult to bridge that gap and connect with their communities. And on the other hand, for the communities, I think it's important that there should be a recognition by everyone that policing involves dynamic, unpredictable, and very dangerous situations. And I would throw in that it's actually important to remember that not every officer can understand every cultural idiosyncrasy, even if they're acting in good faith. And the example I would use, Mr. Ramadan, is I am an Asian American, and there have been great people I've encountered who've simply mistaken me for somebody else that they have met and like and recognize. And it's not from a bad place. It's one thing that happens as we all try to move forward together. Mm-hmm. And so the question remaining to how to continue our improvements, how to keep all of us on the right track, is how law enforcement agencies and communities can work together to effectively move forward, to build a shared understanding and identify common solutions. Mm-hmm. That's my 2 cents, Mr. Ramadan.
Okay, and I'm going to come back and ask you what role does, like organizations that you're part of, the U.S. Department of Justice, because you're one of how many U.S. attorneys across the United States who are designated in areas?
93, I think, is the number, Mr. Ramadan.
So there is a major role that you play in that process.
We have the opportunity to contribute to trying to build that shared understanding with our communities, working with individuals like you who care about this.
Yes. And now I'll move on. Athar is he's a local practicing attorney who's a graduate of Howard University. He and his wife. And Athar is now not only a practicing attorney locally here, but he's the executive director of ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. Athar, in regards to this matter, is there still a need of push for social injustice? You represent civil liberties in your organization. What's your observations?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for having me on, and salam alaikum to my fellow Muslim listeners. I always appreciate it, intercultural, interfaith dialogue. So on behalf of the American Civil Liberties Union, we're the nation's oldest civil liberties organization. We're a nonpartisan organization. We're a nonprofit organization. We work through policy, public education, and legal work to resolve civil liberties and civil rights issues. Civil liberties issues being really those first 10 amendments of the Constitution are constitutionally protected rights, and civil rights flowing from bodies of law thereafter. Absolutely necessary to continue to put forward social justice measures. I don't even call it the criminal justice system. I refer to it as the criminal legal system. Calling it the criminal justice system, there's an implication there that there's some level of justice. And from what we've seen time and time again, and again, I'm not necessarily questioning the intent of every actor in this space, but the system's failed time and time again, right? And the reason why the criminal legal system is sort of at the forefront of those issues is because it's one of the few areas where there's an actual deprivation of liberty that we see time and time again. So for listeners out there who know people who have been incarcerated, who've been subject to overpenalization, who've been subject to racial profiling, whether that's through the concept of policing or through over-prosecution, whether they've been subject to incarceration for things like fines and fees, which in Nevada, we only recently, this past legislative session, had fines and fees reform. We've seen people time and time again criminalized based off their status, whether that's based on income or just based off a litany of factors that have specifically targeted communities of color. And we can see that time and time again. And that's through in industry practices as well, right? We look at the cannabis industry. 25 years ago, there's this push to incarcerate surrounding marijuana. We see tons of black and brown folks across the country, including here in Nevada, that end up with records as a result of that. And then 25 years later, they're doling out cannabis dispensary licenses, and the majority of the licensees are not from the communities that were unfairly targeted for possession crimes. We see the same thing on other issues like gun control. So while there's always a need to balance those interests against public safety, this creates a visceral reaction in folks because people see it constantly. And when there's still not the system of checks and balances that we're hoping for, and I can give a million examples of that, but obviously I'm going to try to be equitable with how much time I consume. It's not surprising. I think with the advent of social media and the fact that people are seeing these incidents time and time again, over and over and over and over and over, and seeing hand slapping for incidents that occur when there's, abuse on the government's end, but not necessarily the same sort of getaway that occurs when we recognize that civilians are engaged in lower levels of offenses, but are being over-criminalized and are subject to those sort of predatory actions that, often happen as a result of basically background demographics and over-policing and the way that we've approached the criminal legal system. I don't view it as a surprise. So there's definitely a need to continue to have dialogue surrounding it. And, the solutions, there's a wide range of solutions, but what I would argue is that most of the solutions to date have been woefully inadequate, right? And I think Tulsa while we've come far since Tulsa, that should never be sort of a baseline or barometer for what society should look like. The inequities that continue to exist are continuing to plague our country and our state.
All right, well, post-slavery and post-Jim Crow, we find situations like Tulsa. Actually, there's a book called Buried in Bitter Waters that really explores the dynamics of how this went on all over America. But thank you, Athar, for that very informative and very detailed, but very informative. We needed to hear that. Captain Carlos Hank was formerly the captain in the Bolden Area Command, which is largely the historical and black community, and now he's in constitutional affairs. He has oversights over that. So when there are issues, he's the captain. His division looks into the investigation, evaluation, and writing policies and issues, and a lot more than I know about. Captain Hank, you're an African-American man. You're also a cop. You're a police officer. You're in public safety. You're in law enforcement. Is there still a need for social justice that people are calling for?
Well, Mujib, I would say that as an officer on the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department as a whole is in constant change to engage with the community. Whether it's training our officers in implicit bias, whether it's training our officers in fair and impartial policing, we're constantly evolving. Is there a need for it? Yes, there's a need for it, because there's always a need for more transparency. And we have to break down those barriers. We have to break down those roadblocks to constantly engage with our community and ensure we are policing the area pridefully and responsibly, so that the folks in our community don't feel oppressed or misused. I point to, when we had the protests and what have you, we had a large protest on the west side of Las Vegas, and it went quite peacefully. And I would like to point to the folks there understand that we were members of that community, and we engaged with them, and they know that the officers of Bolden Area Command and the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, we do not intentionally treat people wrongly, and therefore I feel that's why the event was so peaceful, and that's why the event was directed toward social injustice, and as it should be, and it was trying to draw attention to that national issue. But as a community, I think we're making strides to level that playing field, so to speak, and make sure we treat everybody as consistently and fairly as possible. But yes, there is a need to continue on, and for us to be as transparent and engage in our community every single day that we go out and police.
Well, one of the clear things that we certainly see with LVMPD, and I'm sure there's even a more need for it, is that transparency by sharing with the public the information about what happens if there's an event between a citizen and an officer. If there's an officer-involved shooting, you have a quick turnaround time in terms of reporting out to the public. And I still need a lot of steps to be taken to continue to improve. Let me question for all three of you. Why does the police department seem to be the center of the target of the criminal justice system? Let's go backwards on this one. Carlos, Captain Hank, why does it seem like no matter what happens, the police department is the center? Because we do have other aspects of the criminal justice system.
Well, I believe that the police department is on the front lines. The police department is in the focus of the engagement with the community. When the attorneys and the court system does not they enforce the law once the person is brought before them. However, that interaction to establish the probable cause to, take that person into custody is at the granular level. It's at the street level. That's what the police officer is there, making the car stop, responding to the robbery call, responding to the sexual assault call. That's the forefront of it. So, that connection is made at the police officer level. So the interaction is magnified whenever it goes wrong, and everyone sees it, feels it, and when it's wrong, it needs to be called out. And specifically for the office that I am now in charge of, internal oversight of constitutional policing, we are here to, if there are bad tactics, if our officers responded poorly or did not engage correctly, we review those policies, we review the tactics, we review those things, those processes to ensure that we get it right the next time if it was not right that time. And we also have citizens that we bring on board so that they can look at this situation and say, hey, you know what, Metro, you need to improve here. You didn't do this right, or you didn't do that right. That involvement and having that oversight by citizens through our use of force board process can help us understand where we have some shortcomings and where we can get better at. Okay. And it's imperative that we continue to have that engagement and continue to have that transparency in order for us to take the necessary steps to continually engage our community positively and to reduce the chances of a situation in that connection between law enforcement, that engagement between law enforcement and citizenry, of that going down the wrong path, or it not going the way that we would want it to go. Okay, so
but there's still improvements need to be made, even at LVMPD. We'll certainly conclude on that point then, right?
Yes, I would say that there are, and we are constantly making strides to do that.
We're going to come back. I'm going to come back to you on that, but thank you, because I want to get Athar. ACLU's perspective, why is the police the focal point of the target of the criminal justice system when there are others involved in that criminal justice system?
Well, 2 points there. First, I don't agree with the premise. I don't think LVMPD is transparent. And there's multiple examples, and I don't think that there's any accountability there. Very limited accountability as well. And I can give example after example, whether personal or professional, along those lines. Even going back to the protests last year that were cited, sure, there was a peaceful protest on the west side, but then you go downtown and you see an individual who's killed, and that investigation was not transparent. Video surveillance only came out 6 months later, and there was a push through Vice to even get that done to national outlets. But me, myself, and other folks who weren't even necessarily near the scene end up detained as a result of effectively bad policing that occurred that night. So, I don't agree with the underlying assessment. When we get to transparency notion, we had the sheriff come out in the last two weeks after saying he didn't comply with 287G, which was where they were going to stop the program of detainers 2 years ago, which was supposed to stop the cooperation that Metro had with ICE. And that appeared to be what he was saying because we had threatened a lawsuit. And in the last 2 weeks, he said that he developed a program, an internal program, that was never made available to the community with no information provided. And at least he spoke to a separate club and said that 10,000 people have been removed from Nevada as a result of his actions, which also wasn't shared with the public. So I don't agree that there's transparency right now. I think that's a fundamental disagreement as a premise. Now, have things gotten better? Maybe. Have we seen the impact of that? Not necessarily. And when we try to do things like get body cam footage or things like that, it becomes cost prohibitive along those lines. But even the process of how complaints are reviewed, and it goes before there's an individual appointed by the county with no consideration of what the family's requests are when those investigations are happening. That's not something that needs to be done. But there are serious flaws within the entire system for how those processes are reviewed. By the actual review boards that occur and by the public fact-finding hearings that occur subsequently, and what ends up happening as a result. And we can see that statistically. I mean, the teeny tiny percentage of officers who have been who have engaged in misconduct that have actually been held accountable to some reasonable standard has been low. But in Henderson, they've turned over the records. We're still waiting on personnel records from Las Vegas Metro, so a lot of that information hasn't been made available. But I'll say because that information hasn't been made available, because the community still doesn't view this as being transparent, and I know that because I get a lot of those complaints all the time, we end up having to put in public records request after public records request, and we're met with unclear policies, even in terms of viewing things like body cam footage, right? There's a reason that there's not full trust there, and it hasn't really hit that point. And I think to that same end, as we continue to explore and grapple with these ideas, what is the reason for this? Are police officers feeling pressured to make arrests? Because I know outside of weeklies, I've been told by multiple folks who have reached out to our office, including Metro officers, that they feel a sense of pressure to go make arrests. Okay, and so they make those arrests whatever way they can.
Well, I like to thank the staff, the administrator and all for putting together these questions, because it's certainly getting detailed answers. And while the answers may vary, that's what interfaith, intercultural dialogue is about. We're not here to convince each other's point of view. We're here to share those points of view. And I thank all of you, gentlemen, and an officer for that captain. U.S. Attorney, your observations, Chris. Why is the police department the center of the target?
Thanks, Mujahid. I think I'd like to talk about two factors, and I think much of it overlaps with what the ACLU and Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department have talked about, but I'll put a slight twist on it. At first, as Captain Hank put it, officers are indeed on the front lines. They're the key point of engagement with the community. Lawyers, judges, as an attorney, we only come in after that initial point of contact has been made, right? And in recent years, I think it's fair to say the job of a police officer has only become more difficult, that they're called upon to wear a lot of different hats. If they're coming out to a domestic incident, they're called on to be counselors. They're called upon to render medical assistance. They're called upon to deal with mental health and abuse situations. And so it's often a dynamic situation that they're faced with. And most importantly, they're the key first point of engagement with the community in an overwhelming majority of situations. And the second factor to your question of why are police interactions with the community, often the spotlight, go back to a lot of things that the ACLU has mentioned, and that I think it's a lot of common ground, that we can easily spend the rest of the afternoon, the rest of the night, going through a laundry list of examples of unjust situations, unjust outcomes, even in recent years. And I think Athar put it precisely right, which is Tulsa. We've come a long way since Tulsa. Tulsa should in no remote way be any sort of acceptable baseline for the sort of society we want to live in. And there's significant work that certainly remains to be done in accountability and transparency. But at the same time, the inherent tension there is, I personally feel that the overwhelming majority of men and women who go into the policing profession choose to become officers so that they can have an opportunity to do good, to protect their communities and serve their citizens. And so that's why I think it's the combination of those two factors. The idea that officers are the front line of engagement with the communities, with part two, which is we still see unjust situations in recent years, but the common sense, the impression I get from speaking with officers and our law enforcement colleagues, that the overwhelming majority of them are going into it to serve the communities.
Okay, and thank you all for responding to that, and it gives us a great deal to think about. And to our listening audience, and if you know someone who's not able to listen, this information will be provided on a YouTube link also, and we will be sending out information where you can listen to it in further detail. This question may almost be redundant in terms of what we've already asked, but does the criminal justice system have a history of oppression or suppression of the rights of people of color in general and African Americans in particular? Again, let's go back to yourself on this one first. Athar, is there a history that we have here, and are we affected by that history today? We're living here in the 21st century. Slavery started in 1519, ended in 1865. Then we had neo-slavery from 1865 to the end of the Reconstruction era, which was probably about 12 years. And since that time, we had to fight our way back to civil rights, and we still have the George Floyds and the Breonna Taylors going on of the world. So does the criminal justice system have this type of history of this type of oppression and suppression? And should people working in public safety law enforcement know about the history of public safety law enforcement in that oppression and in that suppression?
Yeah. So from my perspective, yes, obviously. And I think it's also existing currently, right? And it's not just within the criminal legal system. It's through multiple areas in society, whether we look at our education system, we look at our economic system, we look at predatory practices in other economic areas, what occurred with redlining and the preclusion of black folks throughout the country to be able to get mortgages where they needed to, and sort of being subject to consistently inadequate economic possibilities and opportunities that existed. But through the criminal legal system, it's been really since the inception of the country that there's been issues along those lines. And, there are constantly communities that are working towards improvement along those lines. But at the end of the day, has that improvement been sufficient enough to draw the bridge to where we think that there's justice that's actually occurring in the system? And the answer from my perspective is no. I mean, I'm actually hoping that one day I'll be put out of work, right? Like my position should not exist. And the day that the ACLU or other organizations are necessary because civil liberties and civil rights infractions stop, will be a great day for this country. Do I see that day coming anytime soon? Not really, and we've seen that time and time again, not just through the incidents that have received tons of visibility, and rightfully so, but through issues that people are experiencing day to day. One of the examples of this that I provide, and it's when I'm critical of policing, I'm critical of the system of policing, and that's an important distinction that exists. I think folks oftentimes construe criticisms of the way that we police throughout the country, including in our community, with the actions of every individual officer, right? And there's distinctions to be had there. The moral aspect of it is distinct from sort of what we view as the injustice behind the nature of policing and what we attempt to do, which is continuing to put forward criminal penalty after criminal penalty, oftentimes dealing with possession issues, possession of drugs, possession of firearms, over and over and over, and we see this play out. And then we look at who's disproportionately impacted, and oftentimes at those levels, we look at the preclusionary aspects of what occurs afterwards, and it's people of color over and over, and predominantly black folks that have been negatively impacted by these policies that exist. And so with police being at the forefront, I don't know that the blame is simply put on police. There's criticism to be shared all around. I see a whole lot of criticism of elected officials all the time, rightfully so. I see criticism of prosecutorial system for not providing accountability to the degree necessary, rightfully so. Realistically, I see a lot of criticism of our courts, and rightfully so. I mean, we've seen decision after decision across a multitude of issues which continue to roll back civil rights and civil liberties. And so as a result of that, there's a lack of faith, in my opinion, amongst a lot of the segments of society that exist, and there's a reason why tension continues to boil up. It's not just a matter of having positive intentions and attempting to work through the issues, because the fundamental challenge that exists is why are we engaging in practices that look like this? Why are we criminalizing things like why have we historically criminalized things like marijuana possession when just couple decades later we recognize it's a lucrative enough industry to capitalize off it, and that system continues to permeate. And so as a result, I don't know why anyone would be confused why there's a lack of faith in the system overall. And despite efforts in terms of community affairs, I think a lot of those issues are continuing to exist and permeate. So that's kind of my response there. And I don't necessarily think it's individual officers that are the target of that unless there's individual actions that accompany that. I think it's the system of policing that people have went after. And to that same point, we don't want officers to be responding to mental health crises either. We don't want them to be serving as family counselors either. And I don't know any officers that do either. I don't think they should be put in that position. But the allocation of resources, because we continue to provide minimal resources for all these other outlets, like let's dump people who are not experts in the subject, into this field to be able to solve for these issues. And at the end of the day, it ends up costing taxpayers on the back end. So that's kind of my thoughts along those lines.
No, certainly. And yourself, Officer Hank, your observation about that, the historical oppression suppression, specifically of African Americans, does criminal justice has it played a role and continues to play a role in that?
Well, I think the history would tell us that, yes, there's been some oppression and suppression of people of color. I think that is without a doubt that has occurred. However, I would say as an agency and here in Las Vegas, I think our criminal justice system is evolving. I feel that as a member of this agency and being a person of color, I see an agency that is striving every day to ensure that it evolves, to reduce the chances of oppression and suppression by how we focus our police tactics to address violent crime, and to increase the quality of life of our citizens in Las Vegas. We are not perfect by no stretch of the imagination, but we strive every day to ensure that we use sound tactics to go out there and address the violent crime that's plaguing our city, to increase the quality of life. And that has no color. That has no, we're not focusing on one specific, this area or that area. We use intelligence-led policing in order to do that. And that's an evolution, I believe, that is critical to reducing the chance of oppression and suppression of people of color.
Okay. Yes, Attorney, your observation. Chris.
Thanks, Mujahid. I think what Athar said about redlining is just a quintessential example of a significant barrier for people of color to equality. And if we expand that from the economic system to and talk about the criminal justice system, I think the key point that I think it sounds like we all agree is that communities are making progress towards improvement in some agencies. If we look at any given agency, there's going to be a lot of areas where we could all sit down and say they are doing well in terms of making progress on these areas. But there are going to be other areas where they need to make improvement, perhaps drastic improvements. And the extent to which that list balances out varies community by community. I have a different perspective based on growing up in Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s. With that perspective and backdrop, I see many improvements, a lot of things that Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department is doing well, but I think we'd all be kidding ourselves. And if I'm hearing Officer Hank right, no, there's certainly a lot of things left to do that we can continue to make progress on. And nobody would say with a straight face that we're already there in terms of accountability and transparency.
Because we do see strides being made, but as I'm hearing Athar say, and believe me, LVMPD has a multicultural advisory council that actually, and it's good to have ACLU as a organizational member, because Athar not only gets a chance to address these issues from the perspective of how ACLU deals with it in terms of judicial issues, but also part of the discussion and reshaping the department's policies and issues. So there's progress to be made, but as we can see, we've had almost 300 years of this. It's not going to change overnight, but we have to keep addressing it, and that's what interfaith, intercultural dialogue is really all about. There's a particular issue that actually one person who's over the Department of Juvenile Justice Services recently asked about, and it's Captain Hank, help give me some clarity on this one here. It's the Police Officers' Bill of Right. What is that law called that doesn't allow the citizens to sue the police officers? What is that policy? What is that a law called? Captain Hank, are you there?
Yes. I believe you're referring to the Police Officers' Bill of Rights.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Basically, it's NRS 289. I don't have the specifics in front of me right now, but what is your question about that, Mujib?
Well, there's questions in terms of public is saying that law needs to be removed. I'm sure the attorneys can give me another name for it, but it's invalid and it prevents the citizens from getting due justice. How does the police departments around the country see that? How does police see that?
Well, I'll address it from this perspective. The police officers go out there every single day and they put themselves on the line to police the community in their best possible way. And when you look at suing a police officer for some actions that they may have taken, left or right, in a particular situation, the court system, the justice system, there's a lot of different moving parts that goes into holding that officer accountable. Just like we use officer, if he used inappropriate force, they go through a use of force process. We also have a tactical review board, and these officers are held accountable, and discipline is issued out, and up to including termination when they are when it is found that they've used tactics inappropriately, and but the protections that officers have is, I would say, I would just say this, that's above my pay grade, mm-hmm. And I would expand to say I would divert to the attorneys. Mm-hmm. I know that there's been some, specifically the Attorney General's office. There's been some changes that have been made to the NRS and to make it hold police more accountable. But we have to understand something. These are human beings that are going out there and they're trying to do the best job they can every single day, and they're putting their lives on the line. And when you start to erode the protections of those law enforcement officers, I think you run the risk sometimes of maybe eroding the the number of folks that may want to take up this mantle and defend the community against those predators out there. So I think there needs to be a balance there between the two. Whether or not officers are, how we're held accountable. We do have a system that is in place to hold officers accountable, specifically suing officers. I would defer to someone else to expand on that. But what I would say is that our officers go out there and they do the best job they can each and every day. And I personally wouldn't want my officers being worried about being sued as they go out there and conduct their business. I think that would erode the ability for them to actually do their job.
Oh, good point. I'm glad to hear you bring all that forward. If I can, we have about 20 minutes left, gentlemen. I'm going to ask you to consolidate on some. I may just cut in on you on a few to move on. U.S. Attorney Chris, what about that? We know about this. I'm not sure how much DOJ is involved. There's this ongoing question about, does it give the officers too much or not enough responsibility in their actions?
You read my mind, Mr. Ramadan, that in terms of state law, the Department of Justice is not involved. We're not going to comment on the pros and cons of certain policies.
Understood.
I will point out, of course, as Officer Hanks said, that policing often involves unpredictable and very dangerous situations. And at the same time, on behalf of the Department of Justice, what I can say is we're proud to be able to enforce and bring prosecutions for violations of civil rights like we've seen in Minnesota. And I don't want to say anything that gets me in hot water in terms of commenting on state law, Mr. Ramadan.
No, I certainly understand, and we appreciate your candidness on that, Chris. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
I'm sure this is something that you don't want to comment on yourself.
Oh yeah, I can fill in for Chris, and also I appreciate hearing Captain Hanks' perspective here, but obviously I also recognize the challenges when somebody is in a position representing an agency, and the agency has to. There's no way to criticize the policies, I think, or be critical of those policies in a fair way, because that was mandated by the state. The Police Officers' Bill of Rights was a terrible piece of legislation from our perspective and undercut every notion of accountability that's existed. I recognize that there's arguments out there that there's an internal mechanism to hold officers accountable. We haven't seen that happen consistently. I'd be interested to know if LVMPD would be interested in sharing statistics about how many officers they've terminated in the last few years for misconduct, how many officers have engaged in, or there's been reports of misconduct and it hasn't led to a termination. I know we saw stories out of Henderson, because those were the public records that were released and weren't, protected as being confidential personnel files, where we saw incidents of misconduct. One officer had over a dozen incidents of misconduct that were reported, and he was promoted. And we recognize that this is something that's existed time and time again. So the reason why we push for lawsuits, and look, regardless of whether or not I work for folks, we're happy to engage in lawsuits along those lines, because we recognize those civil penalties sometimes are the only way to bring about change. If there's not any sort of threat and it's hand slapping on the back end, there's nothing that occurs. We can look at the data and see that it's been insufficient in terms of discipline. And the reason why all of this stuff happened, and I think some of the listeners will probably appreciate this, and even some of the folks over there, the police officers have a very strong union. And that's across the country, but it's here as well. The police union is very, very strong. And so because of their strength, because of how much money they put in, because of how they run campaigns, and they did this the last election as well, and the election before that, and it's not necessarily a knock on, I'm not viewing it from a morality standpoint. The facts are the facts. They have a strong union that comes out in force, and they push policy agendas that they want, including things like a police officer's Bill of Rights, which you wouldn't expect necessarily to get done under Democratic leadership and under a Democratic state government, but they did, right? And so as a result, there was a lot of blanket protections that went in. They came back, they reversed a couple of those provisions, but we absolutely need people to think twice before they do something like pull a trigger. And I know that's not obviously a common thought, because the retort to that is that it's in the moment. But we've seen also incidents time and time again where there hasn't been discipline that's come out of that, right? And the incident that I mentioned with respect to Jorge Gomez, and I don't want to spend 4 hours, talking about specific incidents, but we saw that this was an individual whose back was turned and he was walking away, He was fired at with non-lethal rounds from behind, and he was shot on his side. I mean, the video was crystal clear there, and there was no charges brought. That's an issue, in my opinion, where the district attorney's office didn't engage. There was no sort of accountability. So what's going to happen? The officers there, and I believe Officer Chiou, who was the one involved, who ended up resigning subsequently, wasn't terminated. And we don't know if he would have been terminated. He wasn't subject to their jurisdiction by the point of that happening because of his resignation. He had multiple use of force incidents even preceding that, and then he was made a training officer. That's why he didn't have a body camera on. So, there's a lot of issues along those lines, I think, that continue to permeate. But having the inability through the courts because of issues like qualified immunity to prevent basically justice from occurring, and even the only thing that can happen thereafter is a slapping of the wrist, is in large part why people continue to complain about the system, and probably in part why there's going to end up being more protests. This isn't the last time we've seen an improper use of force. Wasn't last summer. We've seen it time and time again every summer, and they're going to continue to happen until we can roll back some of the principles related to qualified immunity, which continues to improperly protect, in my opinion, improperly protect police officers in a way that no other industry should get. I mean, imagine if a teacher engaged in that. Would they get the same slap on the wrist if there was a violent assault against a student? Mm-hmm. Absolutely not. They would be terminated.
Captain Hank, Metro, LVMPD, has a policy in order to even where officers can intervene and report on other officers. How effective is that in addressing that? You're in that division now that has oversight over that. What is Metro doing to prevent some of the circumstances that Athar was speaking on?
Well, if an officer, the specific policy you're talking about, the duty to intervene policy, I feel has basically reinforced the notion that officers must engage, must report when they see an officer doing something that they're not supposed to be doing, whether it's against law, whether it's against policy, or what have you. I think that it has.
And if they don't report that, what's the consequence for the officer who doesn't report?
Well, that person will be depending on it can include up to termination. If they don't report it, depending on how egregious the incident is. Okay. So that a statement of complaint would be filed. If it's observed that the officer did not do what they were supposed to do, an internal investigation will be generated. And if that officer, if it's determined that officer should have reported something. And then that officer would be dealt with. There's a disciplinary matrix that's identified, and that they will be held accountable to that discipline up to termination. And officers have been terminated. I don't have the numbers for you, but officers have been terminated for doing things on this agency that they shouldn't do. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the notion that officers aren't being held accountable on the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, I will tell you that I know from experience that they have been held accountable. I was a lieutenant in the Internal Affairs section. Officers are being held accountable, and they are being dealt with. This is not an organization that takes its goals and its mission lightly. We go out there and strive to serve the community every single day. I disagree with some of the comments, but it's a constant evolution. The agency is progressing. We're not there, but that's part of the process, but we're striving to get there.
Well, is that what you think led to President Obama's report in 2016 on 21st century policing? LVMPD was actually mentioned as the only police department that they researched that seems to be in 21st century policing, actually. Is some of those type of initiatives what led to that?
Yes, our use of force. I mean, since I believe it's 2013, we revamped our use of force policy like 4 times. I mean, what other agency can even step up? I mean, we got agencies around the country that haven't updated their policy since the 60s. This agency is constantly changing. So, as a police officer, I will say this, and I don't like being held under the same light as other agencies, because just like no citizen would want to be held under the same light as the actions of someone else. Look at us for what we do. Look at us for how transparent we are. Look at us for the engagement that we give. And I think you will see an agency that is striving every day to engage its community and police it with the pride that it deserves.
Well, after I think in both U.S. Attorney Chris, Chiou, both of you, and after your organization participates in the MAC meetings, and Chris, your organization, yourself or some of your staff participate, I hope that steps are being taken and some of these things are being addressed, but it tells us we have a long way to go. Probably last question for all the three of you. Why is the criminal justice system and systemic racism viewed as one institution or synonymous to one another? Why do you think that happens to be? After, let's start with yourself first on this last question.
Can you repeat the question again?
Why is the criminal justice system throughout itself and the systemic racism of America many times viewed by many citizens of color as either one institution and or synonymous with one another?
Yeah, I think in large part because it's been, again, to my very initial point, during the beginning of our conversation, people have seen this deprivation of liberty that's occurred. We recognize what happens after the fact. When an individual ends up making contact with the criminal legal system, their life is oftentimes forever impacted. And when we recognize that an individual has been incarcerated, if they've been tried and convicted of a crime, depending on, what it is, but not even necessarily depending on what it is, there's long-lasting ramifications there. But to that same point, though, it's not just one element, and I repeat the point because I think you made a good point earlier, and everybody else made a similar point. There's not one element of systemic racism that's occurring, across the country or has historically existed. It's crossed every single sector, whether that's education, whether that's housing, whether that's economics, and so a lot of those issues end up having a direct result that negatively impact folks as well. The difference is that the criminal legal system is on display constantly because people are expecting, with the word justice invoked, that justice will occur, right? And from many of our vantage point, that hasn't happened. I mean, to Captain Hank's point specifically about termination, I don't know what those numbers are because they're not constantly released. I know the numbers we've seen in the incidents we've seen that have been reported where we would have assumed there would have been a termination. That did not happen. So I don't. My understanding was it was less than 2%. That was the last stat that I had seen. Even on violations that are serious, right? So we view most of the practices that exist as green lighting for practices. And while we're happy to participate in initiatives, including the Multicultural Advisory Council, we continue to engage in lawsuits for that very reason. I mean, and part of the problem that we're currently facing is your sheriff is now a candidate and he's making statements everywhere. So when you discuss the concept of having, secret systems to detain individuals and to assess who's undocumented and who's not and cooperating with ICE after publicly saying that wasn't going to happen, then giving a separate statement of a separate event saying 10,000 individuals were removed under his watch, that wasn't what LVMPD has been saying for the last couple of years. So I think there's problems on a couple fronts. I think it's weird that he has not yet resigned, and it seems that he's making these statements on behalf of Metro. And so it continues to deteriorate efforts, and now we're wondering what's going to happen, in the next few months ahead when it comes down to other issues. What other secret programs exist that nobody knew about, right? And we have to continue to jump through hoops to find those. So I think the synonymous nature of it exists for that very reason, the lack of transparency and the fact that now things are, coming on display, which we wouldn't have expected before either.
Captain Hank, your observation, why is the criminal justice system, systemic racism seen as one institution or connected to one another?
Well, I think we should look at, everybody sees, when we talk about systemic racism, we look at, okay, it's oppression by the cops. But then you also have to look at, all right, well, there needs to be judicial reform. The police do not, we're one arm of the judicial system, and then you have another arm of judicial system, which is, you have the courts. And the people are voted into office. They're voted into the courts. The judges that we vote into office they make decisions based upon the information that's provided to them, and they need to be held accountable, just like law enforcement needs to be held accountable for the actions that we do. And I just feel that as a community. I would say a law enforcement community, we all need to take responsibility for the areas that we're responsible for. And I think judicial reform needs to have its fair attention, and we shouldn't group everything under just basically law enforcement as being the bad guy here, because that's the arm that takes you into custody. That's the arm that you have the engagement with. If there's we respond to 4,000 calls a year.
Right.
4,000 calls a day.
And I got 2 minutes left. I got 3 minutes left. So Captain Hank.
Okay, I'll make it quick. We respond to about 4,000 calls a day, engagements with the community every single day, and we have. We're not getting 4,000 calls complaining that officers are violating rights every day. Mm-hmm. We're doing some good job, doing an excellent job out there.
Well said, well taken. So no, we take that as value, but I want to give the U.S. Attorney this chance to chime in, and I need to do some house cleaning before we conclude. So thank you, but I think very good, solid observation, Captain Hank, which I think myself, Chris, and Athar are aware of some of those things that are happening that are good. Chris, your observation. Why are those two seen together?
Thanks, Mujahid. I know you're pressed for time. I'll be brief. It's basically what Athar and Captain Hank have said. Injustices in the criminal justice system are so visible. When an innocent woman or man is incarcerated, that's on display for everyone to see, as Athar put it. Whereas some of the other underlying causes of inequity that persist, like redlining and housing, we don't see it. There's no video. There's no visceral image of someone being denied for a loan or not able to live in a particular neighborhood. When someone's denied access to education, it's a rejection letter. That's not a salient image. Whereas, so to answer your question of why criminal justice is often highlighted in discussions about systemic racism, my 2 cents is it's because it's so visible, and it's because it stands out so much for